Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started with our seminar. I apologize that we're a couple of minutes behind schedule. We've been transitioning from a meeting right into a seminar. No worries, Sue, it's okay. My name is Stephanie Malinoff. I'm the program director for the Roadway Safety Institute here at the University of Minnesota, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all here in the room to today's seminar, but also to our remote participants as well. We typically get a good handful of people who watch these presentations from around the region and actually around the country as well. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Max Donath, our Institute's director, sends his apologies for not being able to be here today. He does his best to try to attend, but he had a scheduling conflict, so asked for me to be here in his stead. This seminar this afternoon is part of the Advanced Transportation Technologies Seminar Series that's hosted through the Roadway Safety Institute. And for those of you who haven't been to one of our seminars in the past, not only do we get practitioners from the field that come and listen to our presentations, we also offer the seminar series as a one-credit course for students at the University of Minnesota. So there are several students in the room here today who come every week and have some requirements about attending classes and writing up summary reports to get exposed to different safety-related topics in their education. So for those of you students in the room, obviously Max isn't here today. Kylie, our course coordinator, is also gone today, but Hannah in the back is here. She has papers from previous time to hand back if you haven't already figured out a way to get them from Kylie. I know she's been in touch with all of you. We also have a schedule of upcoming seminars on our website, and I believe Hannah should have some copies if anybody is interested. We do send electronic reminders 2 weeks before each seminar, so keep your eye out for those, and don't get confused with what's happening one week when we're marketing for the next week. For those of you that are connecting online and watching us remotely, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, those of you in the room can't see it, but for those of you watching remotely, there's a little chat box or text bubble. We ask that you click on that bubble, and if you could type in your name, your affiliation, and the number of people that are viewing the webinar from your location. That's important information for us to have. We do try to track how many people and who attend these workshops for reporting requirement reasons for the US DOT. For everybody, if you wouldn't mind holding questions until the end of the seminar, given we've got a couple speakers and we've got people in person and people watching remotely, we'll try and do questions all at the end. You'll notice that I am speaking into a microphone, but it's not being projected through the room. It's for our remote participants. So for those of you in the room, if you do have a question, I'll try and get the microphone to you so that the people watching remotely can hear as well. So I will stop there and introduce our speakers for today so that we can spend the rest of the time hearing from them. We have Frank Dauma and Nicole Morris with us today. Frank is a research fellow and associate director of the State and Local Policy Program at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs here at the University of Minnesota. And Nicole Morris is a research associate with the Human First Lab, also here at the University of Minnesota. And they are going to talk to us about some of their recent work. The title of their presentation is Big Brother is My Co-Pilot, Impacts of and Attitudes Toward Driver Behavior Regulations. So without further ado, Frank, I think you're going to kick us off.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you all for coming. I hope you found this title to be something that grabs your attention. And what I'll be talking about, along with Nicole today, is that when it comes to trying to improve transportation safety these days, it's not just things that you can do to the car, but it also is innovative ways to affect how people are behaving primarily behind the wheel. And in today's talk, I'll talk very briefly about why there is an interest on behalf of government to really affect how someone acts when they are in the car, and then talk about a couple examples that I've looked at, in the latter case with Nicole, regarding a couple of these types of behavior, both in terms of how people react to these policies and what some of the impacts are or could be when implemented. So first, why does government even have the ability, legally, politically, what have you, to tell you how to behave once you get in the car and hit the road? Well, first of all is, quite simply, the government has an interest in making sure that as many of its citizens continue to live and pay taxes as long as they can. And the fact that we are losing 30,000 of these taxpayers every year causes consternation among lots of people for many more reasons than simply the fact that they are a taxpayer or Social Security number. The other issue is that in 2008, NHTSA did a study that indicated of these roughly 30,000 fatalities that happen each year, somewhere between 90 and 95% are attributable, at least in part, to human error. So to a certain degree, we are our worst enemy inside the car, and possibly if we could affect the way that we're behaving inside that car, more of us will live to drive another day. Now, on the more legal side, there is certainly data showing that these interventions can improve the safety. So that is the sort of substantial argument for why government would want to get into the car with you, if you will. Hence the Big Brother is my co-pilot title. But also, legally, there is not a lot of protection for what you're doing inside the car. Back in 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court explicitly said that you have no expectation of privacy in your movements on the public thoroughfare. And a few years later, in 1991, the court said that all a police officer needs is simply probable cause, basically a good suspicion, that something is going on inside your car that is not in the government's interest, and therefore they can get their nose in there and figure it out. Now, as more information has started to be accumulated inside the car, the extent that can be looked into is being somewhat limited. You may know of the case that came out this summer that said the data on your smartphone needs a warrant to be searched. But nonetheless, whether you are wearing your seatbelt or any other stuff that might be invisible, or in view, I should say, in the car is probably fair game. So with that as a very brief establishment of why Big Brother is sitting there in the car with you, let me explore a study that we did, sponsored by Minnesota Department of Public Safety, looking at the impacts of Big Brother saying you really shouldn't go anywhere without putting that seatbelt on. Specifically, I'm talking about the primary seatbelt enforcement law. There's two kinds of seatbelt laws that are in the United States. A third, if you include New Hampshire's lack of a seatbelt law. But there's secondary laws, which simply say you must have your seatbelt on, but but no police officer is able to enforce that unless you have been pulled over for a different offense. Then there is a primary seatbelt law, where a police officer may pull you over simply because she or he observes that you are not wearing your seatbelt, and they are going to issue a citation for that offense alone. Minnesota was a secondary offense state until 2009, when the legislature changed the law to a primary offense. So the first question is, particularly maybe among this audience, why is this even controversial? Wearing your seatbelt is generally a lot safer practice than not wearing one. But there is a vocal group that points out, in their opinion, that the decision to wear a seatbelt or not is a personal one. And whether you wear it or not is only affecting your own health. I'm not going to refute these yet. I'm just going to put their perspective out there. The second is that, indeed, I'm inside my car is my castle. How can you tell me in the first place what I should do inside this car? The third, this is unnecessary. I'm a safe driver to begin with. I'm not going to hurt anyone. And I've survived this long without one. And finally, don't you know that if you are wearing a seatbelt, it exposes you to possible injury that you would not have if you weren't wearing your seatbelt, depending on certain kinds of crashes. And so, therefore, it's not actually any safer. So it's not exactly a dropkick, yes, this makes a lot of sense, regulation. Countering those perspectives, and I'll first put out there the one that Nicole gave me earlier today. The idea that you're not hurting anyone else. If you are not belted and you are a passenger in a car, and you are hit and you go flying into the driver or another passenger, then indeed you have hurt somebody else for not wearing your seatbelt. But on the more academic perspective, we had the Center for Excellence in Rural Safety at the Humphrey Center for several years, Humphrey School, I should say. And we did a couple of reports, which one estimated that seatbelt laws, primary seatbelt laws, in states that currently had secondary or no seatbelt law would result in a 7 to 8% reduction in fatalities. And in Minnesota, this was estimated in 2006 to mean 17 lives in rural areas alone would have been saved. And in 2008, we estimated it could have meant another 14 more. Remember that Minnesota did not become primary until 2009. Then what we did in our actual study for public safety is we looked at the difference between what would have been expected in terms of fatalities between 2009 and 2011, which was the data we had available to us at the time, if there had been no change, versus the number of fatalities that actually occurred. To get to the bottom line on this, we determined that during that 2-year period there was actually, we could estimate a difference of 68 fatalities, 321 incapacitating injuries, 432 serious injuries that did not happen because of the presence of the primary seatbelt law. One factor that might seem to indicate this is actually due to the seatbelt law is the fact that we saw minor injuries go up. So possibly injuries that could have been much worse ended up just being minor injuries because people were wearing seatbelts. Possibly. This is a graphic representation of what we were seeing. Basically, I'll use the mouse here for folks online. The dashed line is our estimation of what would have been expected fatalities, injuries had there not been a change in the law, and the green marks are the actual numbers. So here in fatalities in particular, you can see the actual number of fatalities being below the estimated line. Now, again, with this audience, saving lives should be enough. But we still have the question of, it's my life, and if I lose it, who is that going to hurt? Well, in Minnesota, we actually pay taxes to help keep people stay healthy if they don't have their own insurance. And the Minnesota Department of Health tracks hospital costs for people who go to the hospital. And so we were able to get data on the hospital stays for people coming in with injuries from car crashes that required treatment. Note, this does not even include the fatality costs. This is just injuries. And in 2009-2011 point of view, the average hospital charge for an incapacitating injury was $120,000, and it goes down to $22,000 for a serious and $3,000 for a minor injury. By our calculations then, just looking at the injuries, we estimated that by multiplying the number of injuries that did not happen times the average cost, there was $37 million saved in incapacitating injuries, $9 million in serious injuries, and about $2.5 million more spent in minor injuries because of the increase in those. What does this mean in terms of Minnesota's interest? Well, 22% of the hospital charges that we estimated come from government sources, whether that's Medicaid, Medicare, or other sources, such as if somebody is a public employee and they receive their insurance that way. Running that 22% out shows that $9 million, almost $10 million was not spent on helping people recover from car crashes that did not occur, or injuries that they did not receive because there was the primary seatbelt law. So, again, the question is this really controversial? Well, in 2010, with Center for Excellence in Rural Safety, we found that nearly 3 out of 4 people actually support primary seatbelt laws. And in 2013, DPS did a survey that showed exactly 3 out of 4 Minnesotans felt that it was either fairly important or very important that the seatbelt law be primary. Well, okay, from a political perspective, that's showing that there's pretty good landslide majority in favor. And yet, we actually have a much higher rate of seatbelt use observed in the state. 19 out of 20 people are actually using their seatbelts. Is it possible that this difference between this 20% between 75 and 95 are wearing the seatbelt because the law is there? It's possible. I certainly know there's at least one person out there buckling up, kicking and screaming because they sent me an email after we sent this message. They called me names that I hadn't heard since middle school. They said the forefathers would not approve of my research. So I thought maybe I was onto something when we initially got into this. After I received that email, I knew I was onto something. So I was very glad that DPS came back and asked us to update this research using data up to 2013. And we found that the number had increased since 2009 to 132 fewer deaths, 434 fewer severe injuries, and 1,270 fewer moderate injuries. Again, we're still seeing an increase in minor injuries. This is a result in $67 million in avoided hospital charges now, 16 million of which would have been public tax dollars. So roughly $4 million a year the state is not having to spend to get people better in the hospital since primary was passed. So I put that out there as an example where we have some good data to show that even though something is controversial, there are still positive impacts out there. And it's a matter of trying to bring the reality into line with the remaining sort of opposition. Another example that is less clear and much more interesting to research at this point is automated speed enforcement. Speeding has been estimated to be a factor in 31% of those traffic fatalities, those 30,000 a year that I mentioned. 33,000 in particular in 2009, and 10,000 were speed-related. In Minnesota, 296 speed-related fatalities occurred between 2008 and 2010, which cost over $360 million in damages and health costs. So, could you improve the safety on our roads by controlling speeding if you used an automated enforcement mechanism instead of just officers on the road? It has been shown in other states to be an effective tool for reducing speeding and improving safety. It's used in 14 states and Washington, D.C. It is much more widely used internationally, but it's not used in Minnesota. Specifically, what I'm talking about when I say automated speed enforcement is the idea of having a radar and a camera by the side of the road being able to, one, detect when somebody is exceeding the speed limit, and two, be able to take a picture of the car and be able to issue a ticket that way. This can take many different forms. Here's kind of a wide spectrum from a stationary permanent camera and radar that are out there by itself to one that can be moved to various places where an enforcement emphasis should be implemented, to a movable form that also would have a police officer on site. You can then take these three ways of taking a picture and recording speed and have a number of different ways to actually therefore implement automated speed enforcement, with everything from issuing a ticket that is just like you received a ticket from a police officer at the side of the road, to getting a letter in the mail saying, by the way, we know you speed, don't do it again, but no ticket. That would be called a warning. And I'll get into those details later in the talk. Now, why is this controversial? Well, first of all, in Minnesota, we have a speed law that is itself a bit ambiguous. For some roads in the state, there is a strict liability standard. That is to say that if you have been caught exceeding the speed limit, you basically need to pay the fine unless you can prove maybe that it wasn't you. This applies within municipal boundaries and where the state statute indicates that their speed limit is an absolute speed limit. Those two restrictions, municipalities and absolute speed limits, still leaves quite a number of miles in the state with what is called a reasonable and prudent speed limit. We usually see that as 55. But the way the statute is written is that a person is only speeding if they can be proven to have not exercised due care to drive at a speed that is reasonable and prudent. This means that on those roads, if you are driving 50 miles an hour in a snowstorm in a 55 zone, you can be ticketed. It also means that if you are driving 65 to get around somebody while passing, you probably won't be ticketed. This is something that is pretty much only interesting to lawyers, but also people who decide that they need to fight their speeding ticket. Further confusing this is Minnesota has what's called the Dimmler Amendment, which means on those 55 and 60 mile an hour speed limit roads, yes, you can get a ticket, but it will not be recorded on your driving record. So you're speeding, but we'll kind of maybe not remember that you were speeding. And DPS did a survey in 2009 that found 1 in 3 people believe that they can actually exceed the speed limit by 6 to 15 miles an hour before they would ever receive a ticket. In other words, 55 means maybe 61. And further, again, making automated enforcement controversial is the State v. Kuhlman case, which is the case that threw out the red light cameras in Minneapolis. Now, it's widely believed that this was thrown out because Minneapolis's red light cameras violated the privacy of the drivers. That was what was reported. Legally, that is not the case at all. The court basically found, one, there was no express authorization for Minneapolis to have these cameras, and two, Minneapolis did not have the right to do it without a state express authorization because of the way Minneapolis instituted it, which was to take a picture of the license plate and issue the ticket to the owner of the car without an explicit permission from the state to hold the owner of the car liable for the driver of the car. In other words, there is a legal distinction, even though it's not often seen in practice, where the driver of the car can be different from the owner, and you need an explicit authorization from the state to hold the owner liable for actions of the driver. One example where that does exist is if you are to go around a school bus with the stop arm extended. In that case, all the bus driver needs to do is record the license plate, and the owner of that car will be issued the ticket. Since that didn't happen in Minneapolis, the red light cameras had to be taken down. But for automated speed enforcement, it simply says, probably you need to go to the legislature to get approval for this. It does not say it is unconstitutional or otherwise forever prohibited to do automated enforcement in Minnesota. After this time, we did another survey of Minnesotans, and we asked them, what do you think of automated speed enforcement? What do you think of it on all roads where many people violate the speed limits, on roads where many people have died, on roads near schools, or in construction zones where workers are endangered, also, basically work zones? What we found is, okay, doing automated speed enforcement on all roads probably is not going to be very popular politically, where there's less than 50% support for that. But in school zones and in construction zones, not only is there a high degree of support between somewhat and very, greater than 50% of the respondents are very supportive of deploying automated speed enforcement in those two places. So we wanted to get into looking at, well, maybe that would be a good idea. And I'll turn it over to Nicole now to discuss some of the background research on these two, deploying automated speed enforcement in these places.
Okay. So one of the things about thinking about automated speed enforcement and why would it work really well in school zones and work zones and not the general roads. Well, one is talking about when we're thinking about what would work is public acceptance. So Frank just discussed that there's not as much public acceptance of automated speed enforcement on all roads. But when we think about what's unique about work zones and school zones, there's also other reasons why it would work really well in those zones and maybe not have quite as much uptake for efficacy on all roads. So one of the things that Frank did prior to me coming onto this project is they really looked at crash data across the board for work zones and school zones and used that really as a proxy measure to see is there a particular problem of speeding in those work zones? Because we know that if you take ASE into an area where there is a lot of speeding, you're going to have a lot of success in reducing that. So what they did find was that there is a problem of speeding in these zones, and then when they looked at officials in other states where they had done automated speed enforcement, got a lot of lessons learned from them as well, and said this is really going to be effective if you go into these areas where people have the most support for them, and they have more support for them in work zones and school zones. And then on top of that, they convened an advisory panel of stakeholders with regard to these two areas to really start building up sort of our expert base so we can know how should we proceed with this. So school zones, it's certainly a lot of problem with school zones of speeding, and there's very little tolerance of the population for people speeding through school zones. But as far as crashes go and fatalities go, it's fairly low. So really shifting our attention to work zones where we see more crashes, more fatalities, more serious injuries. So for the purposes moving forward, we're really just going to be, of this presentation, thinking about work zones. So when we look at the crashes in work zones, we see between 2003 and 2011, on average, about 10 fatalities or so a year. So that may not seem very high, but when we're dealing with 350 to 400 fatals a year, it's taking up a pretty big percentage of the fatalities when we think about how much of the roadways at any given time are actually a maintenance or work zone or utility zone. It's not very much. So it's representing a substantial portion of our fatals, a substantial portion of our injury crashes, and our property damage only crashes. Okay, so what's unique about driving behavior in work zones? So one, obviously, it's unique because just by nature, the roads have been changed, and it's just not business as usual when you go through a work zone. So things are narrow, there's a lot of hazards around, it's a sort of a stressful thing for drivers to go through. But on top of that, we have a lot of other issues of drivers are not very good at predicting how much time and distance they need to stop if the driver in front of them comes to a sudden stop. So that's something that we see across the board on all roadways, but what's unique about work zones is we have a lot of bottlenecks and a lot of congestion shock waves. So traffic is very likely to come to a sharp stop. And so if drivers aren't very good at predicting how much time and room they need to give themselves, then they end up rear-ending the vehicle in front of them quite frequently. So, and then this is compounded by the fact that we have driver inattention or distraction. Right? So if you're distracted in a work zone, you're more likely to be disregarding signage in the roadway. You're more likely to disregard changing traffic conditions. Your response time is just that much slower. So it's really a recipe for disaster when you're in a work zone and you're distracted. We also have people following too closely. Again, this is just sort of a perceptual and training issue, but people are very impatient. They don't like to go through work zones. If they feel like it's slowing down their route, then they're just going to be that much more on the tail of the driver in front of them trying to get through. And then finally, we have illegal or unsafe speed. So just simply going too fast. So all these things combined, traffic stops in front of you, you're very likely to rear in that vehicle in front of you. So it's no surprise then that rear-end crashes make up a majority of crashes in work zones. So that's the most frequent type of crashes that we see, followed by sideswipe crashes. So you're more likely to see a sideswipe crash in what we call the transition zone of the work zone. So this is where people are likely to be doing some lane changes or diverting off of their normal lane into another lane. And so those are the two most frequent types of crashes that we see. So again, this is really triggered by a lot of this stopping or slowing of traffic conditions. So this is sort of my psychology understanding. I'm not an engineer, but my psychology understanding of really how this works. But when you think about, everybody's trucking along at a decent speed, and you're expecting that, okay, traffic is flowing. Now we're all going 55 miles an hour. Now someone here really hits the brakes. Right? So we have this sort of shock wave that gets sent upstream through traffic, and it just gets greater and greater and greater. And so the deceleration rate needed by the time you get 10 cars back is pretty great because it really ripples through. It's extra problematic if that 10th car back is distracted. So they need a really hard deceleration rate to get stopped in time safely. And if they're inattentive, they're following too closely to the car in front of them, or they're going too fast. Likely it's blammo, they're going to get into a crash. Other things that happen within the work zone is we really have this sort of ebb and flow of traffic speeds. So you have people that are decelerating, maybe they're rubbernecking here. So there's something really interesting that it's like, oh, I've never seen that machinery on the side of the road before. And so everybody starts rubbernecking. They get past that piece of machinery, and then they start picking up speed again. And so now it seems like we're all going to go 60, and this is really great. Or maybe we're all going to go 70. So everybody starts speeding up again. But down here, there's a cop. So now everybody's starting to accelerate, and then you hit somewhere where now we're all going to slam on our brakes. And again, we have these same things. So it just goes back and forth, a lot of speed differentials within the work zone, and this is really dangerous. This is where we see a lot of these rear-end crashes. Okay, so thinking about what do we do to typically try to have speed enforcement. So not only are we wanting people to drive safely and drive within the speed limit, but we really want a lot of speed continuity. Because it's not good when we have some people going much too fast and some people going much too slow and some people in the middle, and that's where we have more and more of that ebb and flow and more potential for rear-end crashes. So aside from these things, we sort of start off with the expected speed limit sign. You tell people, hey, it's 55 mile an hour, everybody should comply. Unfortunately, normal work zone signs, normal speed limit signs are really largely ineffective. So drivers will self-select how fast they think they should go. They'll self-select on lots of different factors that they may say, 45, that's unreasonable, I will not comply. It's 55. And that's what they tell themselves, and that's what they go. Or they say, I don't see any workers on site. And so that doesn't apply in this condition. And so when a work zone is idle, they'll go much faster than when a work zone has workers on site. So that's the sort of things that we know about, normal behavior with signage. Police presence is sort of the go-to, where you would think you have police on site, that's going to reduce people's traffic speed. So the big advantage of police presence, and I'm using that in a really general term, I mean local PD, state patrol, and our county sheriffs. So it's great that they have that one-on-one dialogue, because sometimes it's good to just really get out and talk with folks, tell them about why they're doing something really unsafe, and hopefully change their behavior in the long term. And so I know a lot of law enforcement really enjoy that opportunity to sort of have some counseling with people. The other thing is it's immediate. So you have the potential of stopping somebody from being really, really dangerous out there. So if they're going 90, you don't want to wait 15 days to grab them and snatch them off the road. So it's really great to stop that behavior in real time. And it's highly visible, so we can do these sort of selective traffic enforcement programs where you have a lot of high visibility enforcement, and then everybody's going, oh, the cops are really out on the road, and we're all going to really comply because I see them everywhere. So that's really great. The disadvantage, you need a lot of manpower, especially for those STEP programs, those high visibility things, a lot of overtime for that type of stuff. And then there's even some really weird factors that you wouldn't expect. So you'd think if you see a police car on the side of the road, people are going to slow down. But if their lights are on, they don't slow down. Any guesses why they don't slow down? They already got somebody. They don't have time for me. I'm going to keep going. They don't have another buddy out here. So lights on, lights off even matters, right? So there's all these little nuances about how effective can police be on the side of the road. And then the final thing is there's really poor downstream compliance. So again, drivers know that it's a manpower issue. There's a finite number of officers out on the road, and likely the work zone that I'm in probably has one cop. And if I've already seen him, then the rest of the way I'm home free, right? So I get past that cop, and then everybody's going to speed up, right? So we really don't even have a distance halo effect with police presence, because once you get past them, you think, well, the chances of me getting busted are now pretty small. So I made it, right? Other things, so signage, we have variable speed limit signs, dynamic speed display signs, so that your speed, right? So this is coming into downtown St. Paul. I love these personally for myself because it really keeps me in check. And it's usually pretty good in real time, but again, we have some poor downstream compliance with that. Once people get past them, they speed up. Or some people go, yeah, I don't care. I don't care if the sign tells me I'm speeding. That's not a cop. They're not recording my data. And so some people just disregard these altogether. But we have found that they're fairly successful in reducing some of that speed variability. So that is really good. One advantage of those dynamic speed display signs and the variable speed limit signs is that it does help smooth out some of that traffic pattern. And so that's going to make it less likely to have some of those rear-end crashes in work zones. So finally, ASE. So there's great advantages of automated speed enforcement because it's cost effective. There's less danger. So when a police officer or state patrol officer is sitting on the side of the road, it's dangerous for them. They can be hit by a car that's not paying attention. So it's not dangerous for the officer. There's less manpower required. And we know that it reduces speed. It reduces those top speeders. The average speed comes down. Frequency of injury and fatal crashes go down. And what's really great is there's a time halo and a distance halo. So you don't have that same issue of, well, I got past the cop and now I'm going to speed up. And I think this could be because, we don't have a very good sense of what's the scope and is there going to be another camera down the line. And so within that same work zone, the downstream effects are usually pretty good, that people stay compliant. And even after you remove the cameras, people will stay compliant for much longer than the moment you pull the cop off the road, instantly they go back to speeding, right? Disadvantages. Obviously, it's controversial. Frank has talked about this. It's less mobile than a police car, so it's not as easy to just pick up and move it as we have with a police car. And then we have a really poor time interval, and what I mean by that is, you know, with a toddler, let's say they do something bad, you don't want to wait 14 days and then punish them. They're not going to learn very well. That, you know, I stuck the paperclip in the outlet, and 14 days later I got a shock. Right? You're not going to learn very quickly from that. So when we have this sort of longer interval for the punishment, just learning is not as strong. And so you definitely don't get that immediate feedback, I did something wrong and I got my punishment doled out to me immediately, like you do with a police officer giving you a ticket on the spot. So those are some of the things you know, that's more detrimental. So some of the things that we hope to learn in the future with this is another project that we're doing in a collaboration with MnDOT is how do people potentially change their visual attention when they're going through a work zone. So if there's a police car on the side of the road versus the dynamic speed sign versus automated speed enforcement, are they paying more attention? Are they paying attention to the car in front of them all that much more? So there could be potentially even bigger advantages outside of just speeding, because we may find that people are more vigilant of what they're doing. Maybe they keep themselves in check a little bit more if they're going through an automated speed enforced zone than something else. So stay tuned for that. Oh, okay. Right, so what do we know about work zones, automated speed enforcement in other states? So Illinois was the first state to implement work zone automated speed enforcement in the whole country. So there's a lot of great literature out of Illinois to sort of give us some backing about what should we expect in Minnesota should we ever implement this. Then we have Washington and Maryland that followed suit. Maryland is an interesting instance because one of their big motivations, not only from having a lot of traffic, is that in their Beltway area, it's extremely dangerous for a police officer to pull someone over because the congestion is just so high. And any of that rubbernecking issues and that ebb and flow that they get in the Beltway, if you pull someone over and you're having to divert traffic, is really detrimental to them. So it's all the more advantageous to get that ticketing issue happening on the sideline rather than on the road, because it's just it's too much of a safety issue and a traffic flow issue to have officers pulling people over on the Beltway. So what have we found in these states? Well, we found fairly consistent results with what we see kind of across the literature, is that definitely ASE is changing behavior. So there's no mistaking that it does get people to slow down, and it does reduce crashes. So I hear sometimes from people saying, well, not only is ASE unconstitutional, it doesn't even work. I say, well, you don't read the same literature that I do, because really across the board, the literature is over and over again stating that it absolutely works. So when we think about not only these states, but there are a lot of meta-analyses that have been done that take 30-some papers across the board and they analyze it and make sure everything qualifies and look at these meta-analyses. And what they typically find is 10 to 35% reduction in the proportion of speeders, which is really great. And then we have 14 to 25% reduction in overall crashes. And the most important, we have looking at these meta-analyses across several meta-analyses, they find about a 30 to 40% reduction in serious injury and fatal crashes. So that's big, right? That's really meaningful. That could be your family member, right? That's saved by this implementation. Okay, I'm going to pass this back over to Frank.
So as I mentioned, I'll talk about just a number of these different variables that can go into implementing automated speed enforcement. I mentioned in Minnesota we had the issue of driver versus owner liability. If you want to get the driver, take a picture of them. That's actually legal, even though politically it scares a lot of people. The question of civil versus criminal penalties. It's a quasi-criminal penalty if a police officer pulls you over. It also means that if you put that penalty on a automated ticket, then you have to have an officer probably testify in court. Whereas if you make it more like a parking ticket, you send it out by mail, someone has to pay for it, and it's a much more simple procedure. But it's a different level of punishment. It's usually not as high a fine, and it doesn't go on your record. How much do you want to use automated warnings? Simply saying, hey, we know how fast you're going. That's the same thing as the speed limit signs that show how fast you're going to everybody around you. Does that have an impact? Can you maybe just do a warning system instead of tickets? How are you going to handle non-payment of these fines? A number of different ways to handle that. Often automated speed enforcement mechanisms are implemented and administered by private vendors, not entirely by a public entity. That creates political issues in terms of, well, is this really making money for somebody outside of the state, or is it really a safety measure? That's something that needs to be addressed. How is the evidence authenticated in court hearings? How do you show that the camera was accurate and taking pictures at the right time in the right way? What is the role of law enforcement? Are they actually out there on the street verifying the picture when it's taken? Or is it an unmanned system that you have the officer in court, or is it verified by a third party in a different place? Where does the money go? You have a lot of speeders, you are going to face an issue of having a lot of money. Typically, you would want to think that the revenue is going to go into improved safety measures, because that is where the money was generated in the first place. And maybe you want to do a pilot first, as we show that Washington State is doing it in pilot. What are the goals of doing that? You need to be forthright in terms of what those are. So kind of divide this into three different levels of analysis. What's the liability? Is it driver versus owner? From our perspective, possibly the owner is just the way to go. We're talking about telling somebody, if you're going to drive my car, I want you to do it safely. And it's also somewhat easier to administer that way. That does mean that the sanction probably should be more administrative. So this is just a recommendation as one way to go. There are very good arguments to go with either a conventional speeding ticket, as Illinois does it, or simply with a warning. And do you do it with someone out there on the street or not? Again, the ability to testify toward the accuracy of the ticket is higher when you put someone on the street. What we learned in terms of implementing this in Minnesota is, after a couple of years of study so far, even though we didn't mean to have this be the main outcome, is that we have gotten very good at admiring and describing the problem. You do have a lot of players and stakeholders that need to be brought into agreement before it can be deployed. You need to come into agreement on that automated enforcement is good, how it's going to be implemented, and who's going to be taking the lead in making that happen. And currently in Minnesota, there is not that kind of consensus. So this is a seminar series sponsored by the Roadway Safety Institute, and we are here because we are undertaking a project sponsored by the Roadway Safety Institute, trying to look more deeply into these different stakeholders and what's their motivation and what is influencing their motivations and their perspective on automated speed enforcement, to see if we can start to find that possibly if we dig into the motivations and the influencers, there could be some common ground that could be found, instead of having to do this battle of just general disagreements in terms of how it can be implemented and why it might not be implemented. So, trying to keep ourselves on time for questions. I will come to a close here, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Frank. Let me just make one quick announcement for those of you who are watching online. I understand there have been some technical difficulties and you haven't been able to use that chat bubble. So unfortunately, you won't be able to ask any questions right now over the course of the next few minutes. But Frank, I'm assuming if anybody sent you an email, or Nicole, to the addresses listed up here, you'd be happy to try and answer that
So
way.
long as they don't use the same language as that one person.
You have to be nice to Frank. Also, for those of you watching online, if you have already sent me an email with who you are and how many people are watching, that's great. If you have access to a computer and wouldn't mind doing us a favor, if you could drop an email to roadway@umn.edu, ROADWAY@umn.edu with your name and number of people watching, that would be great and much appreciated. So we've got about 5 minutes. So those of you in the room, let's start there. Any questions for Frank or Nicole?
Lowell Benson, retired from CTS. My question is, and I noticed the statistics on before and after the seatbelt law. Now, in the last couple of years, MnDOT has been promoting the zipper effect when approaching construction zones, going 2 lanes down to 1. Is there any data that shows that the zipper effect moves more traffic more quickly and is safer than getting over when you first see the sign?
I think that's a great problem statement to submit.
So I don't want to step on too many engineers. I feel like John Hordos maybe can speak maybe better to that. But my understanding is that the zipper merge is the superior way to get traffic moving much faster and less bottleneck issues. Now, it's certainly dependent on the flow of traffic. So when you have traffic that's slowing as it's entering that bottleneck, the zipper is much better. But if you have really high speed, low, I don't know what the word is, but you don't want to wait. So you don't want people waiting till last minute to merge if traffic is flowing at 65 miles an hour. So it's most effective when it's slow. And that's my limited understanding. I don't know if Sue, if you want to.
Well, the good news is we have Minnesota State
exactly.
Safety Engineer right here.
So with the zipper merge, the misunderstanding is that you get more vehicles actually throughput, but that is not true. So what is true about it is that you do reduce congestion from the long queue that backs up into subsequent or upstream intersection or interchange, where then you're causing congestion not only on, upstream further than it would need to be, also on sometimes on a roadway that doesn't even have anything to do with the construction at all. So by queuing people up, you shorten the queue, which lessens overall congestion, which does have a safety effect on reducing crashes overall. But you do not get more people through that bottleneck, but it's just a way actually. We believe that it's also safer because you're reducing the speed differential between the 2 lanes. So if you have one lane that's totally stopped and somebody flying by at 45 miles an hour, and then somebody decides I'm going to get over in that lane. So if we just can encourage people to use it. So that's what the research has shown.
So there is no specific research that says accident rates have gone down by X% or gone up by Y% in those zipper areas.
There was an evaluation that was completed, and that's where we know about the throughput. The problem with whether or not you increased or decreased crashes is that the zipper merge isn't out there for a long enough time to really draw conclusions. So we would have to do a lot of them and do a big, huge study, which has not been done.
Thank you, Sue. I think we have time for one more quick question. Anybody else? Okay. Well, join me in thanking Frank and Nicole. Thank you so much, both of you. And we have the pleasure of seeing Nicole again next Thursday afternoon. So she's going to talk a little bit about computerized crash report usability and design investigation. So on the crash reporting side of things. So we hope to see everybody next Thursday afternoon, either here in person or online again. If anybody needs a professional development hour form, we've got some here. And if you're watching remotely and you would like a form, again, that roadway@umn.edu email address would work. We could send you a PDF of something as well. Thank you.
Well, I guess we convinced everybody to buckle up and drive the speed limit.
Yeah. Your job here? We did it!
I love it. If there's anything that would be defined as preaching to the choir, it would be this.